Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming on what I know is a very busy day, but I assure you, you're in for a very special treat. The program this afternoon is very simple. Our Chancellor, Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, who needs no introduction to you, will give a very brief talk. And he's changed the title of his talk based on a conversation we had with President Johnson at dinner last night. So he's actually going to speak a little bit about the Mahabharata, which we thought might actually be more interesting than his other talk would have been interesting as well, but I think this will be more provocative in some ways. So he'll just give a brief talk on the Mahabharata, and after that, President Johnson and I will have a wide-ranging, fun conversation on various aspects of what it means to be a liberal university, challenges of education in the 21st century, our own personal, intellectual, and career trajectory, which is truly extraordinary. So I will introduce her when she comes up front, when we begin the conversation. But I'll just request our Chancellor, Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, not only one of the finest historians of modern India, but one of the wisest historians of modern India, to begin the proceedings.
Good afternoon. Last evening, around the table we were sitting on, there was a lot of discussion about qualities of leadership, equity, justice, fairness, inclusivity, and one of the virtues of being educated in liberal arts is that you have to be quick on your feet and think. So I decided then and there to change the topic of this afternoon's talk and take two instances from one of the great books, not only of India, of the world, and look at, very briefly, at some of these features concerning fairness, goodness, ethical standards, and so on. The epic I'm referring to is called the Mahabharata. It's probably the largest in terms of length to be written. It's longer than the Odyssey and the Iliad put together. It has more than 10,000 verses in Sanskrit. And we often think that this is not only one of the greatest books of India, but one of the greatest books in the world. And the saying about it is, popular saying about it is, what is there in the world is in the Mahabharata. What is not in the Mahabharata is not in the world. So at the very heart of this epic is a great battle between cousins. A set of cousins, 5 brothers, believe that they have a kingdom has been their rightful share of the kingdom has been taken away from them, and they are trying to reclaim it. The other lot, they are trying to, in various ways, trying to retain everything of that kingdom and not give them the rightful share. And this leads to a battle, in fact, a battle that is a holocaust, taking away practically the entire male population of North India, so the epic says. The point at which we catch these 5 brothers, they are in exile. This is nearing the 3rd chapter of the epic. They are in exile in a forest. They have been in exile for 12 years. And we catch them at the end of a very long and tiring day where they have been walking. They are with their wife, I should say. The 5 brothers are married to one woman, a very remarkable woman. This is one of the most celebrated instances of polyandry we have in ancient India. And she is a very, very remarkable woman. Her name is Draupadi. So they are 5 brothers and their wife. They're walking through the forest. As I said, it's been a very long day. And Draupadi says, I can't walk anymore. I'm very thirsty. And so they sit in the shade of a tree, and the eldest brother, who is also the to-be king, Yudhishthira, his name is. And he's supposed to also to be the embodiment of all that is good, ethical in the world. He instructs one of his younger brothers to says, climb on top of the tree and see if there is a water body close by from which we can get some water for our wife and for ourselves. And the younger brother says, yes, there is a huge water body. In fact, I can see it from the top of the tree. So he instructs another of his youngest brother, in fact, to go and get water. The brother doesn't come back. So he sends the brother who had climbed the tree to look for the youngest brother and to get water. He doesn't come back. So he sends his third brother, who is supposed to be the greatest warrior and the greatest archer in the world. There's no such warrior like him. He's called Arjuna. Arjuna goes, and Arjuna doesn't come back. Then he sends the second brother, he's supposed to be the strong man, the strongest man in the world. He goes, he doesn't come back. So Yudhishthira has no other alternative but to leave his wife under the tree and to go and look for his four brothers and this water body to get water. He finds the water body, and he also finds that on the banks of this huge lake there are 4 dead bodies. They are the dead bodies of his 4 brothers. And as he enters the water to get some water in a jug, he hears a booming voice which says, don't draw any water from this lake. This lake is mine. You can't draw any water from this lake till you have answered all my questions to my satisfaction. So Yudhishthira stops in his tracks and he turns around and says, whoever you are, my lord, do show yourself and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So from the top of a tree, a bizarre bird, one-legged, one-eyed, unlike any living being that Yudhishthira had ever set eyes on, emerges. And there follows a set of a question-answer session, 108 questions which this bird, quote unquote, asks of Yudhishthira, and Yudhishthira answers. The questions vary from very mundane general knowledge questions like which animal sleeps standing up, to deeply philosophical questions, what constitutes happiness, what is the path, and so on. After he has answered the 108 questions, this bird says, I'm very happy. You have answered all the questions to my satisfaction, and you can draw water, but because you have answered my questions so well, I will raise one of your brothers. So you tell me who of the 4 you want to be resurrected. And Yudhishthira points to his 4th brother, who is actually his step-brother. The 4th and the 5th brothers are step-brothers of Yudhishthira. And he points to the 4th brother and says, raise Nakula. It's now the turn of the bird to be surprised and bewildered. And it says, why Nakula? He's not even your blood brother. The greatest warrior is lying here, your own brother. The strongest man in the world is lying here. Your most loyal and devout follower is lying here, and you choose your stepbrother. And Yudhishthira says, yes, my lord, I have 2 mothers. Mother Kunti, my mother, one of her sons is alive. I am still alive. I want my mother also to have a son who is alive. So my second mother, Madri, her son Nakula, please raise him. The bird is so pleased and astounded by this answer. He says, it's wonderful. I will raise all your brothers. And he raises the 4 of them. This is a very pivotal story because it enables the narrative to go forward. Imagine if Yudhishthira was left with none of his brothers. He hadn't answered the questions correctly, and he had given the wrong answer regarding raising which brother. There would have been no narrative after this because there would have been no war. Yudhishthira couldn't have gone to war alone without any of his brothers. So it's a very pivotal moment in the story, but it's also a great ethical moment because what happens is not only are the 4 brothers raised, but this bird transmorphs itself and emerges as the god Dharma. Dharma is a peculiar, very complex Sanskrit word which stands for ethics, duty, nobility, goodness, fairness, justice, all these things put together. Dharma is actually what holds the world or the society together. It's the binding force of the world. And the bird transforms itself into Dharma and says, I was testing you. And you have taken the correct ethical call at a very important moment in your life. Carry on with your life. We jump forward towards the end of the epic. And President Johnson, please forgive me because you've heard this story last night. So it's completely at the end of the story. For various reasons, the king Yudhishthira, having won the battle, having got his kingdom, and having emerged as one of the great kings, truly just and noble king, he's got some terrible news, which I'm not going into now, another story. He decides that he's going to renounce his kingdom. He announces this to his brother and to his wife and says, I don't know about all of you, but I am going. I don't want to rule anymore. I will make my grandson the king. He will be the heir, and I am leaving. I am going into the mountains, to the Himalayas. So his 4 brothers and his wife say, my lord, we have always been with you. Where you have gone, we have gone. Whatever decision you have taken, we have followed that decision without questioning you. If you go, we come with you. So one morning, 5 human beings walk out of the palace and out of the town, somewhere very close to where we are, very close, if the historical geography is correct, very close to where we are. So they go out of the town, 5 of them, 6 of them, and unnoticed by them, a mongrel dog follows them. And they go to the Himalayas. And whilst they trek in the Himalayas, one by one, beginning with the wife Draupadi and the brothers, die. They fall by the wayside. And Yudhishthira explains why to his readers and to his second brother, who is the last to fall. He explains why each of them has fallen. One particular fault, lacuna, or vice, whatever you want to call it, was in them that leads them to fall by the wayside. Finally, Yudhishthira is alone. He is alone with that mongrel dog. He has nobody in the wild expanse of the Himalayas. He keeps trekking till one day a chariot descends from heaven. And the king of heaven, Indra, is on the chariot. And he meets Yudhishthira and says, come on board. You have led such a good and exemplary life that you will be the first living being to enter the gates of heaven. Alive, you will enter heaven. So Yudhishthira, of course elated, steps onto the chariot. The dog follows him, as he has been following for so many months or even years. Indra says, no, no, no. The dog is a dirty animal. He is not allowed on this chariot, and he certainly cannot go to heaven. Yudhishthira says, he cannot come with me. Indra says, no, certainly not, he can't come with you. Yudhishthira says, then I cannot go to heaven. He has been with me all this while when my family has gone from me. He has never left me. Through snowstorm, rain, when we didn't have any food, when we have had food, he has shared everything with me. He's given me warmth when I have been cold. I can't go to heaven without him. So the Lord of the heavens says, don't be ridiculous. How can you give up heaven for a dog? Yudhishthira says, sorry, I cannot go to heaven. And he steps off the chariot, refusing this offer to go to heaven. The dog, like that bird, now transforms itself to be the god Dharma. And he says, son, this was your final test, and you have passed it. You did not desert a poor animal because of the lure of heaven. You can now go to heaven. I sincerely hope that the young women who come out of Wellesley and the young men and women who come out of Ashoka will also be able to take similar ethical calls when they meet moral dilemmas and mundane attractions. Thank you.
That's a hard act to follow, but if anybody can, President Johnson can. I won't give an elaborate introduction. She's an absolutely remarkable person. Her accomplishments in her academic field, cardiology and epidemiology, holding professorships at both, at 2 different Harvard medical schools, setting up a pioneering center on gender biology at Brigham and Women's, one of America's leading hospitals. And then this transition to Wellesley College, where she has really become one of the truly extraordinary leaders in education, and particularly liberal education. You just need to sort of, browse through her speeches. There's a TED talk of hers on health and gender I strongly recommend. It's a kind of model of concision and interdisciplinary thinking. It's a real privilege to have you with us. Thank you so much for sparing this time. This will be somewhat of a freewheeling conversation. We thought we'd try and think aloud together about various aspects of liberal education, her own personal trajectory. So let me begin by just inviting you to reflect on your own transition from sort of, as it were, medicine into liberal arts, both the sort of the intellectual premise behind that transition, and also what it felt like institutionally. I mean, I think at Ashoka, one of the things we are actually grappling with, is, despite talk of interdisciplinarity, I think overcoming the 2 cultures problem is easier said than done, as it were, what C.P. Snow called the gap between the science and the humanities. You're one of the people who've done that so remarkably. So I'm sure our students will love to hear from you how that transition happened and, the thinking behind it.
Well, thank you, Vice Chancellor. And I want to say truly, thank you to you, to the Chancellor, and to all of you at Ashoka who have welcomed me and who have welcomed our Business Leadership Council. And in the past, welcomed our delegations here. It is truly an honor to be in partnership with you. So let me just talk a little, answer your question. You know, it's interesting because as I reflect on my career, it's very clear to me that the thread that runs through it is working and being focused on enabling women to really fulfill their potential and to flourish. And initially that was in the area of health and to understand the differences in biology, to understand the context of women's health, to understand how biology intersects with the social environment, how we need to think about policy that then advances women's health. And that is now really translated into liberal arts education at Wellesley. So it's been a very common, very strong theme. And to be honest, Wellesley College as a premier liberal arts college, but a premier liberal arts college for women, is what got me totally excited and very interested in making that move. And then I just want to say something about the liberal, oh, thank you. Say something about the liberal arts, because I do think, sorry if you didn't, I hope I was speaking loud enough. Usually people raise their hands if they can't hear me. But just talking about that intersection between the sciences and the liberal arts. And what I would say is the field that I entered, it was a really, as I was one of the early people in the field, that field, in order for it to develop, must be rooted in a strong liberal arts background. Because in order to even ask the question as to whether or not there are differences, one has to be open to understanding and be able to think about what you see, not just from a science perspective, but from a societal perspective. And that really requires a grounding in more than just a singular science. So I think that without a doubt, without having had a strong liberal arts education, I don't think I ever would have entered the field at that early stage to be able to think across the various disciplines to advance it.
So, you know, particularly when you think of women in STEM subjects, and historically this has been true, it's still true in India, if you think particularly of fields like engineering and stuff, I think there's been a perception that women have not been socially encouraged to go into those fields. There's actually a double burden. One, the sort of perception that they're not encouraged to go into those fields. And second, the kinds of intellectual questions those fields often get focused to and the premises behind. As you now reflect back on this journey you have traversed, how do you think your interaction with liberal science, liberal arts, has helped change the ways in which the STEM disciplines actually think about empowering women and dealing with subjects that in some sense are of vital importance in that area? If you could, maybe perhaps an example or something from your...
So I do think that when you become a living example, that in and of itself opens doors. And when you're becoming a living example, as are many of my colleagues, who can also articulate the fundamentals of their science in a way that is broader than the pure laboratory science. And I'll give you an example. There's a little ringing. But I'll give you an example. One of our scientists focuses on how we think about, I'll stop.
Sorry.
Oh, is that the air conditioning? Yes. Oh, okay. Sounded like a New York City train.
That's exactly right.
But the question is, how do we think about certain aspects of depression and other psychiatric illnesses and the differences? And for many years, the research has been purely done in a way that only focused on male animals and didn't really ask even the question, what about the inclusion of female animals? And this is true across many aspects. But if you think about this, there are many disorders that unequally impact women, yet the research is done in a male model. There was also the social pressure at the time to actually say, now remember, a lot of this is happening on the heels of us fighting for equality, right? And so if you begin to say there are differences in mental health, in ways of learning, let's just say across, is that something that you shouldn't ask because you never know what you're going to find? And the issue is we must ask. We must explore. And we have to be able to understand the differences that we see and be able to understand that they are also multidimensional. So even if you find a biologic difference, biology intersects with the social environment. And what I would say as an example is that we then began to train our young scientists and others on how to ask those questions quite differently, which has led to not just one laboratory doing this, but many. And what that's ended up doing is bringing a number of people into the field because of the ways the questions are being asked. So it's not just the fundamental techniques of doing the science, but it's really about the fundamental questions that bring in a variety and diversity of thought that is so critical to advancing the field in ways that one would not imagine unless we answered those questions.
It's a very powerful story. So in this journey of sort of, the thread that runs your career of sort of, working for empowering women, how do you see the role of all women's colleges like Wellesley's? And let's say for a country like India, right, where so Ashoka has about 56% women students, and I think there's still a debate to be had whether this kind of college is actually more empowering, or let's say perhaps compared to an all women's college. Given that you have sort of been in both kinds of institutions, what's your sense of that question, and what are some of the biggest learnings that Ashoka needs to take on board in thinking, particularly from a pedagogical point of view, empowering women, particularly in STEM subjects?
Yeah. So it's, I do think that we're here with a number of Wellesley alumni who could probably speak more passionately in a way and experientially. But I think for us, what is very, very clear is that being in an all-women's environment paired with a faculty who is over 50% women has a powerful impact. And I pair it with the faculty because I think that, again, having the academic experience in an environment where in STEM fields, for example, where in many areas, particularly in the non-biologic sciences, where the faculty tend to be majority male, having both all women with an example in front of you of women faculty and male faculty who have been sensitized and who have had to work with women colleagues in not just the one or two, but quite frankly, as equals, in equal volume, to me is a transformative experience. And I think making sure, nothing is by chance. We work at this all the time, which is how to ensure that our students feel empowered to have their voices heard. And remember, not all students are the same. It's a diversity of students, all women, but a diversity in that group. How do we work to essentially ensure that we are being inclusive, that there is equity? And I think being a women's college, we probably come from that vantage point in a way that is very powerful. So I think that we can learn a lot from that experience And then there's, of course, the alumni who play a tremendously important role in the life of the college and in the lives of our students as living examples of what going to a women's college means. And then lastly, I want to really focus, I think, on the science of this, because this isn't, part of this is experiential. And even though there are many students who come to Wellesley who are coming to Wellesley because it's an outstanding liberal arts college, not because it's a women's college, traditionally, that by time they leave, I can say it almost universally, they are all convinced that their all-women's education has been a powerful influence on their lives. Now, why is that? And what makes economics in an all-women's college the #1 major for at least a few generations? What makes it so that computer science is soaring in a male-dominated field, and we see our students moving into areas with full confidence? What is it when we see astrophysics? And I could go on and on. And I do think that studying what is it that is different about the all-women's environment versus a co-ed is worthwhile. And there is a study actually that is near completion, so I have an early sense of the results. But we have a group of investigators from the social sciences and sciences looking at a couple of different fields, economics being one, and really digging deeply into what is it about the pedagogy, what is it about the experience that is different. And when that comes out, I will share it with you.
Absolutely. We have a lot to learn, I think, on this front. So just continuing this theme, but maybe switching gears slightly, which is, the whole idea of liberal education in the 21st century. And there's a kind of paradox, which is, on the one hand, prestigious and elite colleges like Wellesley are much in demand. They're everybody's dream in some senses. And yet, when you look at broad political and social currents, there is also great skepticism about the idea of liberal education and what it actually means in the 21st century. From different quarters, some think it's become too ideological, some think it's a luxury that if you want to be prepared for the workplace, you cannot afford, so the instrumental critique. To what extent does Wellesley feel the pressure of those currents and help us navigate those currents, because we also feel them all the time, so.
Well, I think there is no doubt that there has been a movement in the United States, quite frankly, against traditional liberal arts education. And the sense of, quote unquote, lack of focus on preparation. And I think the fundamental is that there's, oh, thank you. That it's going to be warm. We're just going to be warm for a bit. But the lack of our filling that void of voice. So where did we go wrong? I think we assumed, in the way of being in the academy, that everyone would inherently understand our value. And when you inherently believe that your value is understood, you know there's a gap. And I do think that for quite a while, we've been a little too comfortable in that area. And when, and now as we think about the, essentially the argument that we are in an ivory tower, we are not, in a way, as I said, preparing, that it's a luxury. We're now getting out to tell our story, to do the work, to prove the value. So we're really going to have to get in front of this. So just from a pure view of preparation, let's just talk about that, because it is an end game. We're not going to talk about the value of the education in and of itself, but let's just talk about the outcomes. We know today that students who have had a liberal arts education are better prepared for today's economy. We know that they are better prepared to address the complex issues. We know that they are better prepared to move forward as industries change rapidly, that they have the basic understanding of how to approach problem solving through that critical thinking lens that is uniquely provided by a liberal arts education. So that's the outcome. We should close that, but I think we have to constantly talk, and there are studies that show this, and we have to talk about the data. Now, the experience, in terms of it being an ivory tower and lack of accessibility, I think we now have to talk about how we have made ourselves more accessible, that this vision of an ivory tower only for an elite few is, in fact, not true. Is it for everybody? Has it been provided for everybody? It has not. But I think getting out there to talk about our stories of whether you have need-blind admission, what we are doing to bring students from a tremendous diversity of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, international, and not just how you bring them to a campus, but what you are doing on that campus to engage students so that they are equally included and experience the education in a very powerful way. So I think we've not necessarily told the story, and we need to do much better at that.
We should join forces in that. So just picking up on that theme, and one of the things you've spoken powerfully about is a challenge facing almost all university campuses across the world, which is the dilemmas around free speech. Universities are meant to be forums for open debate and discussion, and have prided themselves on defending those liberties. And yet, in very many different contexts, from the United States to India, in part, universities are being attacked as the sites that are actually proscribing free speech, that are inhibiting free speech. That's sort of one end of the critique. On the other end of the critique is, of course, the idea that no matter what one's views on the law of free speech might be, the fact of the matter is, as you've said, words oppress and words hurt. So at institutions like Wellesley, how have you negotiated this dilemma? And I know this is an issue close to your heart, which is a frequent topic of discussion amongst our students.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's a hard one, and I don't think there are good answers. I mean, there are ways in which today we have to work very hard at preserving our ability to have open dialogue and open debate. That is not something that happens by chance. It is, again, a fundamental of liberal arts education. Academic freedom and free speech, active debate, it is the way that ideas are born. One, I think, again, this is an area where we've come under attack, but prior to being under attack, we probably did not talk about this issue in a very active way. And we didn't work as actively as we needed to work to ensure that these types of discussions, debates, in the classroom is one thing, but it's also outside of the classroom. We are residential colleges, which means that part of the education is in the classroom, but there's a continuum, a very powerful continuum between the classroom and that residential experience. And I met your dean of students, and we have an outstanding, and she's outstanding, and we have an outstanding one as well. And focusing on how we work with our students to be able to negotiate difference, to embrace difference, to have discussions across difference is something that is hard work these days. Our students today are of a different generation. A lot of the conversations more than 25 years ago have been curated, right? They've been curated online. So there's a way in which frequently one doesn't have to face difference. You can live in your own world. that is in direct opposition to what we believe a strong liberal arts education should be. So we are working actively on this. We don't have an answer, but I can tell you one thing we do have is a group of faculty, students, and staff have now been meeting for almost a year, and they've actually spent last weekend together drafting a set of recommendations to come to me to recommend how we promote free speech on campus, and this is across every aspect of the college. Now I'm going to say one last thing on this, because free speech, in my mind, does not mean actively inciting controversial or negative reaction. We are educational institutions, so that when I say free speech, this is all in the spirit of education. So a lot of what's happened in the United States around very controversial fringe speakers, to me, that's not education. That is purely an invitation for provocation. And I think we have to really make that clear as leaders in education, and we have to fight against that. Because if that's the only reason, then those people really shouldn't be on our campuses. Not because we reject them personally, but because we are educational institutions. And as we think about bringing people to campus, and then I'll stop. As we think about bringing people to campus, it's not a passive act. This is active. We must bring our students to the table, just like we are teaching them how to talk across difference in our residence halls or in every place, but we have active roles to play. So I think we've been very passive on this until it's kind of come to bite us. And it's time to take the reins, set the agenda forward, and get back to, I think, what we really believe are the values.
I'd love to exchange notes with you on free speech policies, actually. I mean, it's again, I think 2 years ago, Ashoka drafted a document on this, which has served us well. And I think the cardinal principle in this is exactly the distinction between provocation and argument, and that any speaker is welcome to campus, but they also then have to honor the protocols of answering question and debate. So it doesn't go just unremarked as a provocation. Right. I think that was one of the institutional steps we took. Moving from sort of liberty to equality and returning back to your theme, another issue of great importance in universities these days, and again, I'll be candid with you, we are wrestling with this. In the US, this is structured around sort of Title IX controversies and sexual harassment. And the real sort of difficulties of, in a sense, aligning ethical standards with legal standards, with administratively prosecutable standards. And I think I know you've made a lot of recommendations recently about how to actually just broaden the way in which we think about harassment, but also how one takes active steps to combat it. So I think we'd love to hear from you and sort of, how your thinking has evolved on this issue, and in an administrative capacity, how does one actually, sort of realize those values that I think we all share and passionately believe in, and what does it mean to actually institutionalize them?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. This is a huge issue in our country, and I know it's an enormous issue here. It's an issue around the world. One of the, again, areas, or I should say, most institutions have taken a very legalistic approach to this. So the approach to issues of harassment have really been from the perspective of how do we avoid risk in an institution. And so even things like training have been around how does the institution avoid risk, as opposed to what is the culture change we need to embrace so that we are actually preventing harassment from occurring. And that's a fundamental difference in perspective that I would say if there's one thing we all must do is really take that stance of the cultural aspect of What does it mean to prevent harassment? Because the rates of harassment, and that's everything from gender harassment, which are, as I like to say, the put-downs as opposed to the come-ons, to the forms of harassment that are more known, whether it be assault or quid pro quo, sexual harassment. We know that those forms of harassment have actually not really decreased to any great degree ever since we've been measuring them. So if that's the case, we know that whatever we've been doing is wrong. We know how to get the bad actors, and then we hold up getting the 1 or 2 or 3 bad actors as if that's the answer. And we know it's not, because there are more bad actors in the pipeline. So this isn't an issue of a bad actor. It's an issue of what are we doing that is culturally allowing this to continue in the current era. So I think, to me, that's one of the fundamental questions, and we have enough data today to actually know what some of those things are. I just recently co-chaired the first evidence-based report on the prevention of sexual harassment in academic STEM, and that was through the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. All 3 got together to address this topic. And you can read the report online. It is, as I said, the first evidence-based report. And there are many things we can do, whether it be around training, bystander training, changing our models of mentorship, which tend to be very singular, one-on-one, making a mentee totally dependent on a mentor, which can set up a very difficult situation. And I won't go through the whole list, but there are a number of areas where we can make real change in our organizations. The rules are important. You know, the rules around, relationships between faculty and students, and I think that's kind of the groundwork, but it's the cultural change. And I'm going to end where I started talking about Wellesley earlier. Changing the makeup of the faculty is critical. When you have extraordinarily male-dominated fields, the rates are higher. And the rates are higher in male-dominated fields, also where there's field work. So there are ways that we can look at this where we know where to go. We just have to have the will to do it.